Thank you, Michael. Welcome to everybody attending the webinar. During today's webinar, I'll take you through the background to the review, how to navigate the Consultation Regulatory Impact Statement, or series, how to navigate the draft code. I'll then hand over to my colleague, Matt Arkell, who will take you through the key changes and next steps. We'll then open up the floor to questions. And as Michael mentioned, if you have questions along the way, please pop them in the chat and we'll come to them during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. In 2020, the NTC released an issues paper examining the legal framework for the land transport of dangerous goods. Many of the submissions we received highlighted that problems were more with the code itself rather than the legal framework. Stakeholders identified that the land mode provisions of the code had not been comprehensively reviewed for 15 years and that there were significant gaps in these provisions. It was also believed that the benefits envisaged from the move from ADG 6 to ADG 7 had not been fully realised. In November 2020, the Infrastructure and Transport Ministers meeting, ITM, endorsed the NTC's recommendation to conduct a full review of the code. Specifically, the scope of the review has been to incorporate ADR and RID concepts. For those who are unfamiliar with the ADR, it is the Agreement for the International Transport of Dangerous Goods by Land, and the RID is the equivalent for rail. In doing this, we've followed the structure taken from the ADR. Where possible, ADR provisions have been used as a model, but replacing the ADG code with the ADR or becoming a party to ADR has never been in scope. We've also looked to update and address issues with the current code by identifying and correcting translation errors, updating outdated chapters from older editions of the code, and incorporating the requirements for Class 1. Since January 2023, we've released 12 topic-specific discussion papers. These included a total of over 300 questions. We received around 140 submissions from 51 different people or organisations. All parts of the code other than Part 1 were released during this time. In some cases, we circled back and addressed topics multiple times. We've now consolidated all of the comments received and amended and redrafted some provisions in response. A Consultation Regulatory Impact Statement at the series has now been prepared and is now available on our website, along with a complete draft of the code. The draft code addresses gaps, incorporates existing determinations, aligns with best practices, and manages new risks to keep the transport of dangerous goods safe. Consultation on the series and the draft code will be open until 10 December 2024. We expect there will need to be some changes made to the draft code in response to this consultation, but the overall shape of the consultation draft code should be as close to final. The series includes a few outstanding matters that we also need your input on. Ultimately, we need to produce a code that meets the needs of all participants, those who need to comply with it, those who need to administer and enforce it, and those who need to maintain it to keep it current. We can only do that if we have input from a broad range of stakeholders. When the final code is approved by ministers, we intend to make it available in both PDF and in a web format, which we hope will support more effective identification of requirements and therefore compliance. Navigating the series. The series follows the guidelines and structure specified by the Office of Impact Analysis, OIA. It's primarily an explanatory document for the draft code. It explains why this review was needed, what we've considered in developing the draft code, and an analysis of the changes that we were proposing to make. It also contains specific questions that we're seeking your input on. As I mentioned, the series is structured as required by the OIA. This structure consists of these chapters on the screen here. The first 4 chapters of the series are primarily background. They detail why the review has been undertaken, what options were considered for how to review the code, and how and why the option chosen was to align more closely to international practices by following the structure of the ADR and RID. The chapters that will be of most interest to you are chapters 5 and 6. Chapter 5 details what the draft code looks like under the option we followed. It also provides information on the changes and the rationale for them. These are set out in order of the parts of the code and then grouped by theme. As you can appreciate, there are too many changes to include all of them in the body of the series. A more comprehensive table of changes is provided in attachment F of the series. Chapter 6 contains the anticipated costs and benefits of the changes. This is initial only and is based on the information we currently have. To improve the accuracy of this information, we need your help. The series contains 7 attachments. There are links to each of these in the series, but they'll also be published individually on our website. Like with the chapters of the series, the first 3 attachments, so A to C, provide background information on how the process for reviewing the code was determined. Attachment E provides a summary of the consultation comments we received to the 12 discussion papers and how these have been considered. The attachments that will be of most interest to you are Attachment D, which is the complete draft of the code, Attachment F, which provides a comprehensive list of the changes, and Attachment G, which is the dangerous goods list in Excel, and you'll be able to sort and search through that for the specific things that you want. Moving on to navigating the code. To help with navigating the code and focusing in on the parts that will be most interest to different stakeholders, we've prepared this short video. Thanks, Michael. As you've just seen, the biggest change to the code is to the structure and flow of information. The contents of the code now provide better alignment with the transport process. This will make navigating the code and identifying the requirements applicable to the task being performed considerably easier than with the current code. This diagram provides an overview of the core parts of the code and their relationship to the main steps in the transport chain. As you can see, each step is relying on and implementing information from the preceding steps. Part 1 of the code applies to everyone along the transport supply chain. It includes general exemptions and concessions, definitions and administrative requirements, and items that could not previously be found in the code. To find out if your operation is captured by the code or any general concessions or exemptions that apply, you should start here. Part 2 of the code looks at classifying dangerous goods. While classification hasn't changed, we have introduced classification codes to assist in understanding the hazards of specific dangerous goods for transport. The flow of information has also been improved with a consistent numbering format used for each class. This part will be most important to manufacturers, importers, and suppliers. Part 3 contains the dangerous goods list, which serves as a central repository for identifying the transport conditions relevant to each UN number. For example, any applicable special provisions, the assigned packing instructions, and any specific handling provisions. Part 3 also contains the provisions for limited or accepted quantities. Parts 4 and 5 contain information on packaging of dangerous goods and preparing them for transport. Importantly, Part 5 is where you will now find information on preparing the dangerous goods transport document and determining what placards are required. Part 7 specifically relates to loading, segregation, and stowage. It includes new information on specific loading, unloading, or handling provisions that apply to some substances. It will be of particular importance to transport providers and those who load or unload vehicles. Part 8 groups all of the requirements for vehicle crews transporting dangerous goods. Importantly, the new structure places greater emphasis on the responsibility of consignors, who are generally the importer or manufacturer of the dangerous goods. This focus recognises that if the consignor gets it wrong, then it makes it very difficult for other parties in the chain to get their part right. It's important to note that while things in the code have moved, they've not been lost. Parts 6 and 9 contain the design, construction, performance and approval requirements for containment types and vehicles. These requirements support the other parts of the code. Thank you, and I will now hand over to Matt.
Thanks, Deborah. Okay, so while the proposed approach to the review that we've undertaken is a step change from past reviews of the code, what we don't anticipate is that it's going to result in significant changes to the more fundamental aspects of land transport of dangerous goods in Australia. So that includes things like how dangerous goods are classified, the packaging that is needed. That includes the packaging instructions, the performance requirements, the various marking and labeling provisions, the manner in which vehicles are placarded and the look and feel of those placards, and things like the segregation rules and the methods that we use for segregating incompatible dangerous goods. So I'm going to run through some of the key changes that have been made as part of this. So there is some shift in terminology to align with the international standards and practices of our source document. So we're doing things like replacing prime contractor with carrier. One of the reasons for that is that the term prime contractor often causes some challenges in understanding duties. We prefer the term carrier. It's a broader term, and it makes it clear that the person who's actually in control of the task is responsible for ensuring compliance. If you're carrying it, you're the carrier. So provisions specific to land transport have been expanded and updated. So we've included a significant number of conditional concessions for lower risk substances. This recognises the varying levels of risk that exist in dangerous goods. Many of the existing land mode provisions continue to exist, but they have been updated and they've been relocated to more appropriate parts of the code. As you saw from Deborah's part, we have rearranged the code more than in a lot of ways. So part 7 of the code is where you'll find special provisions for carriage. These are provisions for the carriage of packages, carriage in bulk, provisions specific to loading, unloading, handling, and specific to operations. So a lot of these provisions already exist, but what we're doing is we're updating them and we're moving them into a place in the code and making it easier for consigners to communicate that information to carriers. So that's one of the real benefits from having these listed as special provisions rather than buried in various places throughout the code. The classic example that we've used for this is that under the current code, the requirement to transport certain dangerous goods in closed vehicles is found in packing instructions, which is not something that drivers of vehicles or carriers typically go looking in. And so it makes it much easier for that information to be more clearly communicated to the person who needs to comply with it. We have done quite a bit of work to ensure that provisions that are currently only found in the regulations are included in the code for transparency purposes. Examples of this include the requirement that persons who are in a flammable liquids vehicle, for instance, aren't allowed to smoke. The only place you'll find that at the moment is in the regulations. And if I can just sort of jump up again, one of the things that we have shifted is the Australian concept of a placardable unit. EIPs are now a vehicle requirement. The draft code doesn't require them on IBCs, but that doesn't mean that a vehicle transporting IBCs is exempt from the need to have EIPs displaying. Next slide, Michael. So we've come up with a new way, or we've followed a new method for presenting exemptions and concessions by consolidating together exemptions and concessions that apply broadly throughout the code together into the front of the code. So concessions for more specific items will continue to stay with their provisions, but where you've got concessions or exemptions that apply across the transport chain, we'd like to consolidate those into one place. So these are things like private transport of dangerous goods for retail sale, and some other things like that. They belong at the front of the code. They set the scene for transport generally. Something that's more of a terminological shift than a conceptual one is the concept of a small load. So this replaces the concept of a placard load. It's not a new concept, but the reason why we've shifted that language is because placarding isn't the only thing that the concessions apply to. There's a range of concessions that apply when you've got a load that doesn't require placarding. And it also clarifies that this is a concession. So generally the way that the new code is structured is that it describes everything you have to do. And then if you have a concession from it, you can take that concession. So we've described small loads in a very similar way to the existing placard load rules, but they're not identical. One of the things we really hope is that they'll be easier to understand. Critically, tanks, bulk containers, MEGCs, tube vehicles, all of these bigger things that mostly fall under the definition of placardable unit now, we've made clear these are not eligible for the small loads provisions. So just like now, if you've got a tank vehicle, whether it's full or nominally empty, it always requires placarding, and it's always subject to the full code. Another thing that we've made clear here is if your vehicle has placards on it, it's not eligible for the small loads concession. If you've got placards on the vehicle, you need to do everything that is required for that vehicle by the code. The concessions that are provided in the small loads section can't be used. We expect that most transporters will choose not to placard vehicles that are well within the small loads thresholds, and that largely boils down to cost of compliance. But we feel that this is a clearer way of setting it out. Thanks, Michael. One of the other things that we've tried to do, I've referenced this before, was incorporating requirements out of the regulations into the code itself. The regulations at the moment contain a lot of what we would describe as technical compliance requirements. However, the only way you know that they apply to you is by going and reading the regulations. So we've proposed to move things like the requirements for transport emergency response planning, some administrative matters relating to tank and packaging approvals, and some more detailed technical matters that are currently only found in the regulation. I referenced the prohibition on smoking earlier on. We've also tried to incorporate determinations that have been issued over the years, and we are hoping to provide a better pathway in future for incorporating when a determination is made by competent authorities and it's appropriate to do so, that we incorporate those into future editions of the code. A newer requirement that may be of interest to everybody is the concept of a dangerous goods safety advisor. So this is a mandatory requirement in ADR countries. At the moment, we've included it as a recommendation, not as a mandate. But what the dangerous goods safety advisor is, it recommends that businesses who are involved in transport, that's consigners, carriers, and the like, that they appoint a dangerous goods safety advisor, a person who is provided with additional training, additional expertise, so that way they can function as a source of knowledge to support safe and compliant transport by the transport company or by the consigner or whoever it may be. It's not a requirement that they be an employee. It's merely that they should be appointed or engaged. But one thing we are seeking input on is whether this position should be mandatory. As I said, it's not mandatory it is mandatory in ADR countries. Where our recommendation is that at the moment is that it's a recommendation, but we'd like input on that. Next slide, Michael. Some other key changes. So consigners and carriers have much the same duties as they do now. Consigners are essentially the owners of dangerous goods, is probably one way to look at them. And our experience in the past has been that sometimes consigners prefer to leave the job of compliance to the transport companies. And that's not ideal. They're the owners of the chemicals. They are the ones who have the most access to information about it. And so what we want to do is we hope that the new code should be encouraging consigners of dangerous goods to provide reliable information to the transport companies, who can then implement the appropriate transport provisions for those goods. So that's things like providing the special provisions that we're including will help to do that. A particular area of change is the incorporation of explosives into the ADG code. So for those of you who are involved in explosives transport, you'll know that the AEC, the Australian Explosives Code, has not been updated since 2009. There's been quite a few revisions of the UN model regulations since then. And so what we're doing is we are proposing that we bring that into the ADG code. Unfortunately, the workload of reviewing the existing AEC, there just simply isn't the resourcing available. So we figure that the best way to deal with this is to bring it into the code, and then it can be maintained. On that front, we are preparing a separate consultation that is specific to the incorporation of Class 1 that's due to commence soon. So if you're transporting Class 1, wait for that, and that will detail those specific issues. So what are the timelines for the code review? So from now until, as Deborah said, 10 December 2024, the consultation regulatory impact statement and the full draft of the code is out for review. We are looking for input on the changes that have been made, and we're particularly interested to hear about areas that have not been discussed in discussion papers. The series has a lot of questions in it. This will help us to compile together the information from all of the affected stakeholders, so that way we can begin to compile the code into its hopefully final version. We need to consider the views of all impacted stakeholders when it comes to developing our final recommendations. So we want to hear from industry stakeholders, we want to hear from regulators, emergency services, we want to hear from anybody who has a view on the various changes that we've proposed. So then into early 2025, we start compiling, on the basis of those responses, all of the code changes, and we build it up into a final version of the code for approval. That also will, in parallel, we'll be drafting legislation to enable the code to go into effect. And then in mid-2025, we will be seeking approval for the new code from infrastructure and transport ministers, with a view for the code to being published in late 2025. And we then expect that our intended commencement date for the new code is 1 October 2026. So that's quite a ways down the road, but that aligns with the end of ADG 7.9. So what do we need from you? We are looking for data on the benefits, costs, and impacts of the changes that we've proposed. Any data that we receive will be de-identified and aggregated. But your advice is what helps us make the case for the right change. It's not change for change's sake. It's about improving the transport system overall. The code has to work for everyone, so we want to hear from everyone on these changes. That includes transporters, regulators, and the NTC. For the NTC, we're the maintainers of the code. And for what it's worth, even if you identify a single issue that you're passionate about giving us information on, please do so. You don't have to answer every question in the series in order to have an opinion. If there's one issue that you are particularly passionate about, please let us know. And one of the things that we've put on our website is we've included a form to help preparing submissions. So that includes all of the questions. And that should substantially ease the process of putting together those responses. And so as I said, there's a link to that on our website. Errors and omissions in the draft code. The draft code is a compilation of the various drafted parts of the code that we've been developing over the last 2 years. It's not perfect. We're aware of some errors already. It's possible that there are things that are hiding that we've missed, things such as misnumberings, those kinds of things. If you come across something and it looks wrong, it could very well be an error. So please let us know. We've got a separate form on that consultation webpage for possible errors that helps us to aggregate them together. Everything, once we've consolidated the code, we have to pull it all together. It's going to go through quality checks. It will go through a bunch of things to check the terminology, make sure everything is consistent. But it's a big job. The code is 1,300 pages long, and there will be some things that sneak through here and there. So as I said, we'll be compiling together all the responses and preparing a final copy of the code for approval by the Infrastructure and Transport Ministers. And as I mentioned, we're doing a separate Class 1 consultation. We are hoping that we will be able to combine the input from Class 1 consultation and the input from the code consultation generally, and pull them all together into a single code that we can seek approval for. Now, there may be things that come up during the consultation that need to be dealt with a little bit more closely. So if we need to, we can undertake additional consultation. But as I mentioned before, there's also all those quality checks and making sure that any inconsistencies are minimized. There's also likely to be some renumbering or rearrangement of the provisions as we pull it all together into a single document. As I said, it's not perfect, but we want it to be as perfect as that can be. So new legislation will be coming as well. We need to make sure that the new code is given proper legal effect with the reordering of the code from ADG 7. It's going to need new legislation. So we'll be working on developing new model legislation that ensures that the new code is uniformly applied across the country. I'll be honest about the explosives side of things. That's going to be a little bit more complex because there isn't harmonised dangerous goods legislation or harmonised transport legislation for Class 1 at the moment. However, we will be drafting the legislation in a class agnostic manner. So should regulators for explosives want to, they should be able to pick up the model legislation for Class 1 as well. It won't cover everything in Class 1. It will only cover the transport side of things. And publication of the new code. So we will be making the new code available in both PDF and HTML. So we want it to be available in a web version. And we're also going to be making the dangerous goods list available as a spreadsheet. We want everybody to have the best chance of being able to comply with the new code, and making this information readily available is the best way to support that. The other thing that we need to do is a guidance program. So the update to the code is significant for everyone who's involved in transport. As we said, the look and feel of transport itself will mostly be the same, but where you find things is going to change. So we've started working on guidance material for both industry and regulators. We want everybody to have the best chance of complying from day one. We also want to hopefully lift the standard of knowledge in the industry about where to find things in the code. So the key document that we're working on is a guide for businesses who transport dangerous goods. That's not just transport companies, that's also consigners. But hopefully that will support a higher level of compliance by helping people to find the information they need to do their job safely and effectively. And the other thing that we're thinking about is what specific topics might require more detailed guidance to support that transition. A particular example there is Class 1. The shift from the AEC into the ADG code is going to be a complex one for some transporters, and we want to make sure that we give all of the information that we can to support that transition. And finally, there is still some work to come. When you read the series, you will note that there are some areas that we are still considering. So the question of regulation of diesel as dangerous goods, I'll just hover on that point for a second and just note that when we talk about regulating diesel as dangerous goods, that is not the same as regulating it as petrol. They're not the same. However, we regulate environmentally hazardous substances more tightly than we do diesel at present. And so there's some questions in the series about what the appropriate level of regulation would be. Other things include transitional provisions for the new code. How do we get from the world we're in now to the world of the new code? And how do we do it in a way that causes the least amount of pain? Other things such as licensing for dangerous goods drivers, which aren't strictly a code matter, they are more of a legislation matter, but we need to understand what the appropriate shape of that is. And because the work never stops, there is a bunch of other work programs for the NTC in dangerous goods transport, including the question of what is appropriate training, both for licensed drivers and for everybody else involved in transport. Things like administrative arrangements for approvals for packagings and tankers and those kinds of things, making sure that the system works well, and developing further guidance and harmonization around that to assist people to do their job safely.